Welcome back, everyone. Patrick here, moving on to the next linear systems word problem. So Sam grabs donuts and coffee for his coworkers. One day he buys a dozen donuts and 8 coffees for a total bill of $27.20. Another day he buys 5 donuts and 6 coffees for $15.60. And then we're asked if he was to buy 4 donuts and 10 coffees, what would the total cost be? So notice that in this particular case, we are given the quantity of items that Sam is buying, right? He buys a dozen donuts, 12 donuts, and 8 coffees for this amount. And then another day he's buying 5 donuts and 6 coffees. So these are the quantities. And so the unknown in this case is what is the price per donut and the price per coffee. So that's what we're going to have to solve for first. So that's going to be our x and y variables. And then once we have the price per coffee and donut, we can figure out what 4 donuts and 10 coffees is going to cost Sam. Okay, so if this question was presented in a way where we were given the prices of the coffees and the donuts, so instead of saying he buys a dozen donuts and 8 coffees, maybe he buys donuts that are worth this much per donut and he buys coffees that are worth this much per coffee and the total bill is $27.20, then we'd be solving for these quantities. Okay, so in this case we're given the quantities, we're solving for the unit prices. Sometimes you'll be given unit prices and you'll be solving for quantities. So start recognizing in questions when you get these which particular thing you are solving for once you're reading. The more you read these, the more you'll start seeing the patterns. But usually that's what's happening with these particular types of questions, right? There's a bunch of different questions that you could get. Well, with these kinds of price and revenue or cost questions, you're either given a quantity, solving for a unit price, or given a unit price and then solving for a quantity. So what I'm going to do is introduce the 2 variables. I'm going to let x equal the price per donut. And then I'm going to let y equal the price per coffee. Now, how can we create 2 equations? We have 2 unknowns, so we need 2 equations to solve for those 2 unknowns. So the first part here, the first set of revenue, $27.20, or that's the cost rather. One day he buys a dozen donuts and 8 coffees. So what's the cost of the dozen donuts going to be? Well, it's going to be 12 donuts times the price per donut. Okay, plus what's the total price of the coffee is going to be? Well, it's going to be 8 coffees times the price per coffee, which is going to be y. And the total of that, the total cost of that is going to be $27.20. And then for the next day, he buys 5 donuts. So 5 donuts times the price per donut plus 6 coffees times the price per coffee. The total cost of that is $15.60, like that. Okay, so now we have 2 equations and 2 unknowns. We could solve for the x and y. And so I'm going to solve it with elimination. And in this particular case, let's get rid of the y values. And actually, notice the first equation, we can actually simplify that. So we can divide these by 2, and then we could divide this by 2. Right? Because notice 12 and 8, they're both divisible by 2. So if we do that, you don't necessarily have to. You could just solve from here. So if we were to get rid of the y values, you can just multiply everything by 3, multiply all of this by 4, so then you'd have 24y, and then you could subtract those. The answer you're going to get is the same. There's multiple ways to do this. Just whichever way you're doing it, make sure that you are getting the same solution. This example is under the elimination section, so I am going to be using elimination, but we can simplify this over here. So we can actually divide everything. Oh, actually, we could divide it further. We could divide it by 4, not just 2. So we could divide this by You know what? Let's just keep it like this, right? Because we have a decimal here, and then we're going to be dividing the decimal. So let's just go from here and then do what I just mentioned. So I'm going to multiply this by 3, and then I'm going to multiply this by 4 in order to get the y values the same. If you did want to simplify, so you could take the 12x, you could divide that by 4, you'd have 3x, and then you could divide this by 4, and you'd have 2y, and then this you'd have to divide by 4. So that would give you what? 2720 divided by 2 is 1360. 1360 divided by 2 would be 680. Okay, and then you can just work with this equation and this equation. And then really all you have to do is just multiply this by 3 to get the y values the same. All right, so simplifying it can reduce some time, but again, I'm just going to keep it with these two equations. So when we multiply everything here by 3, we would end up with what? 36x plus 24y. And then over here, 3 times 27.2 would give us $81.60. And then over here, you can multiply everything by 4, so we'd have 20x plus 24y is equal to 4 times 15.6 would give us 62.4, like that. Right? And now we could subtract this from this to get rid of the y values. Another thing I want to mention is, another thing you can do is, because you have decimals here, when we've done questions before where we're working with decimals, I like to multiply everything to get rid of all the decimals. But in this particular case, because these were already integers, then I'll just work with these decimals over here. It's not as big of a deal, but if you did want to get rid of these decimals, you can multiply this by 10, multiply that by 10, but then you'd have to multiply these by 10 as well. You'd just be working with bigger numbers. So that's another way to go about it. Again, all of these different methods should give you the same solution. So subtracting this from this, these cancel out. 36x minus 20x would give us 16x. And then we'll have 8160 minus 6240, which would give us 1920. And then divide both sides by 16. X would end up equaling 1.2. All right, so $1.20, that's the price per donut. Right? That's the x value that we solve for. And then to get the corresponding y value, you can plug that x value into either of these. I'll plug it into this one. So I'll have 5 times 1.2 plus 6y is equal to 1560. 5 times 1.2 would give us 6. Okay, and then we're going to bring this 6 over, so we'd have 6y is equal to 960. 15.6 minus 6, when we bring this over, becomes a negative, is 9.6. And then dividing both sides by 6, y would end up equaling $1.60. All right, so that right there is going to be the price per coffee. Right? So whichever way you do it, just make sure you're getting these two solutions. And then at this point, we're actually not done. So a lot of times these questions are just going to ask for these unit prices, which those would be the answers, but notice we have to go a step further. But at this point, before going into that step, if you do have time on a test, what you could do is you could take these, plug them into the originals, and just make sure left side is equal to the right side. And when you do that, if you plug in 1.2 here, 1.6 over here, 1.2 here, 1.6 over here, you'll notice that for both of them, the left side would equal the right side. So those are the correct solutions. And now to finally answer the question, they're buying, or Sam is buying 4 donuts. So what's the cost going to be for 4 donuts? That their cost is $1.20 per donut, and then 10 coffees, which is $1.60 per coffee. So the donuts are going to cost $4.80. The coffees are going to cost $16. Adding these up, $20.80. All right, so that ends up being the final answer to this question. That's the cost for 4 donuts and 10 coffees.